Welcome to Real America on C-SPAN 3's American History TV. 40 years ago, in the wake of Watergate, the United States Senate created a special committee to look into the
been in complete violation of its charter. It was to have no domestic intelligence applications. And that allegation came about a month after the midterm elections of 1974, when a large group of so-called Watergate babies were elected to Congress. And many of them had run on a campaign pledge to clean up the executive branch and to come into Congress to provide better oversight of the executive branch. So something like.
Okay, so Congress. That is today's, this week's a reading on the role of U.S. Congress in making U.S. foreign policy. And perhaps we've already implied that the role of the Congress in overseeing U.S. foreign policy has not been particularly effective in some ways, particularly given the fact that the people that wrote the U.S. Constitution originally intended that the U.S. Congress be the most important body of the U.S. government. If you look at the U.S. Constitution of the United States, and so we click here and make sure that you can see that the Constitution of the United States, here is the Wikipedia entry for the Constitution of the United States. You can see Article 1, there's only 7 articles in this short document. In the first article, it's not covering the powers of the U.S. president. The first article covers the powers of the U.S. Congress, implying that the writers of the U.S. Constitution, the people that framed the U.S. government, expected the Congress to be the leading body, the most important body in the American national government system. And then only Article 2 are the powers of the president outlined. And that reflects the legacy of the American Revolution, in that the leaders of the American independence war against Great Britain were opposing what they saw as the tyranny of the executive branch of the British Crown, of the British royal government, and that the tyranny of the British executive branch in the form of the governors appointed by the British executive, which was the king, the monarchy, with the prime minister serving at the will of the king in regard to foreign relations, including the empire. The role of the colonies in the empire was determined not by the British House of Commons, but by the British monarch and his ministers, as represented by the governors, the royal governors, that the British king appointed to rule over the 13 colonies. So in the anger and hostility towards the British central government, the executive monarchy and the governors representing the monarchy, the people that wrote the U.S. Constitution, the founders of the United States Constitution, expected the Congress, representing the citizenry of the new independent country, would be the most important actor. But That was a long time ago, almost 250 years ago. So here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and we see the US president appears to be, in a lot of ways, the executive branch of the US government has in many ways become the most important and the most salient and the most visual element of the US national government. And that is due to a number of factors, including the rise of nationalism and the development of an American national identity out of these 13 original colonies. It expanded to 50. And as a result of economic national development, the Civil War, removing barriers to the development of a national economy and a national identity around that national economy, immigration coming into the US, and then America becoming involved in global politics through the 19th century, but particularly in the 20th century with the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War, that the US presidency, the US executive branch, as represented by the US president, has become the leader, the leading actor in the American political system, even in domestic policy, because typically the executive branch of the US government makes the first proposals for what the laws of the United States should be, even regarding domestic policy, public policy within the United States, not to mention foreign policy. The Congress responds to and debates and amends and supports or rejects proposals that first come from the executive branch of the US government. So the US executive branch, in a sense, sets the agenda about what the Congress is going to debate, approve, reject, amend, change, after the executive branch submits its budget proposals to the US Congress, not only in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. And, of course, 250 years ago, America was a very different place in many different ways. Now America is a highly industrialized global power, and you see that the executive branch has become very, very powerful to the extent that the executive branch, in the form of the president, can fight wars, enter the United States into global conflicts, into wars, without first getting approval from the US Congress, as we saw in 1950 in Korea. Harry S. Truman, president of the United States, deployed US forces to fight the invading North Korean army in South Korea without asking the Congress first to approve doing that. Now, later, of course, the US Congress would, in effect, approve the US involvement in the war in Korea in 1950 by approving money, spending money, devoting resources to fighting the Korean War, so that the US Congress, in effect, did approve the US involvement in the war, but after the war had already started. And that would be true also in Vietnam. So the US Congress is supposed to represent the will of the American people across all 535 members of the US Senate and House of Representatives, to give more voice and expression to the diverse opinions and desires and wishes of the different groups and constituencies that make up the United States of America, the different groups and constituencies that make up the American people. But we see, however, that the US Congress is particularly influenced by not the typical human citizen of the United States, but by those groups that have tremendous political resources, because particularly, not only, but particularly also because they have tremendous economic resources. So business groups, lobby groups in particular, have a tremendous amount of influence over the US Congress, because the Congress men and women rely upon those business groups to provide them with the resources they need to win elections. And keep in mind, if I'm a citizen of the United States, I have a job. So I want my employer or my business to thrive, because if my employer, my company that employs me thrives, I thrive, or I can thrive. So even though we say businesses have too much influence, keep in mind that most people have jobs working for businesses or owning their own businesses in the United States. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that businesses have tremendous influence over the US Congress, and business groups and economic interests have tremendous influence over the US Congress, because 80% of a person's social life, my life, your life, is connected with economics, if you include your career, right? Your career, whether you're a professor or a teacher or a business person, you need that money in order to survive, to buy the material you need to live, to take care of your family, and to prepare your children for education, for the future, and to retire. So 80% of our social existence as human beings is connected with economics and business. So, okay, so that sets the context for our debate here that I want to first introduce and highlight first a news article to highlight the role of these different groups. Before we do that, I have to make sure that I don't forget that we do the attendance. So let me go back to share screen, and we go here. And week 6, add smart attendance, and your number is 536. 536 is your smart attendance number. So put that in the chat. 536 is your smart attendance number. And then, okay, so let me go back now and talk about lobby groups. So we talked last class, or the previous classes, about how the world economy, and that means the United States economy and the Chinese economy and the European economies, have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to address the challenge of global climate change that's caused by human activity. And we highlighted how now that these economic issues of a country like China, the United States, are becoming global issues, more and more obviously become global issues of interdependency in a world in which we cannot address this challenge of global climate change, of Anthropocene, mankind-made climate change, because that's what Anthropocene means, unless we make domestic economic policy a topic of global foreign policy, global international relations. So we see increasing blur or intermixing of international and domestic affairs, of foreign policy and domestic economic policy are becoming increasingly hard to separate. They maybe always have been interrelated, but the point is that people are becoming more obviously aware of this fact. They can see it. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has really illustrated the extent to which, to people, what has always been true, that my well-being depends upon your well-being and your well-being depends upon my well-being. That's always been true. But the point is that now it becomes more and more obvious to more and more people, including people that typically do not pay close attention to politics, because they're told you got to get a COVID-19 vaccination because of a virus that emerged in China. And if we don't get it and can control all over the world, then we're always going to have this virus. So you need to do this, and you need to also be concerned about the virus in Africa and the virus in India, because if we don't get the virus in Africa controlled, we're always going to have to worry about this virus circulating and mutating and having new variants like the Delta variant. And many Americans agree that yes, we have to be concerned about the well-being of people in Africa. We need to get Africans vaccinated. But many Americans respond with a hostile attitude that, you're undermining and threatening America's sovereign independence by claiming that America has to compromise with other countries and postpone getting COVID-19 booster shots because we need those vaccine shots not for boosters, for third doses, but we need to first get Africa vaccinated. And only 3% of Africans have been vaccinated. And many Americans go, I don't like to hear this. I don't want to believe that my well-being depends upon outcomes and policies that are adopted by other governments. So, and now, but that is one element of global interdependency. Global climate change, of course, is causing more and more natural, economic, weather-related disasters, more flooding, more droughts. That causes more migration of more and more people leaving Africa and South America because their farms are collapsing, because there's no water, because there's no rain due to climate change, and so on. So we know at an elite level that our well-being depends upon cooperation with other countries. And we need to cooperate in developing our economies and agreeing to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, oil, gas, but particularly oil and coal, and also gas. So we see this issue now coming to a crisis point in the global international affairs. And Joe Biden, President Joe Biden of the United States, is again, as I said, as the President of the United States, is taking the lead in coming up with an American strategy for dealing with climate change. And he has posed a big, large program that is hundreds and hundreds of pages of text long that he has proposed to the Congress. And the Congress is now responding to the executive branch proposal. That the American executive branch has to take the lead on this. The Congress is not taking the lead. The American president takes the lead. And he or she makes proposal in the form of laws that can be thousands of pages in length. And the Congress responds. It amends, it changes, it approves, it disapproves, but the president, executive branch has to lead. And it goes here. And so what do we see? As President Joe Biden, after winning the election, has proposed a $3.5 trillion, $3.5 billion program for Social Security to deal with the changing global economy and the globalization of the American economy, and climate plan, a string of, and so what do we see? Business interests are using advertisements and other efforts to cajole, means to constrain or push Democrats to change or kill a $3.5 trillion social policy bill. And the whole world is looking at the United States to see whether or not the US president and the US Congress can agree on law that will be passed by Congress and signed by the president to commit the United States seriously to making a revolutionary technological transformation of its economy away from fossil fuels. And if America has to do that, and China has to do that, and Europe has to do that, if we're going to deal with this challenge of global climate change, can the US Congress pass such a series of sweeping programs and laws to transform the American economy towards green energy, towards renewable energy sources, and all of the economic vested interests that already exist, that built up over many years, many decades, and generations, have gotten support for oil and gas and coal industries, and employing thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, are lobbying the US Congress not to pass much of the Biden administration's proposals, because people have invested their money, their careers, their jobs in the existing industries. But climate change programs to address the challenges of climate change require revolutionary transformation away from these old industries, which of course many people view as a threat to their future jobs and their income and their profits and their shares. So this report highlights the lobbying going on now of the US Congress by these different business groups attacking the Biden administration's programs to address, among other things, other challenges, the challenges of global climate change. And it goes on here, as centrist Democrats in Congress, let me make sure you can see this. So we go to share screen, and I think this is it. As centrist Democrats in Congress have worked to block or strip out major provisions of President Biden's $3.5 trillion safety net and climate plan, a string of online advertisements has popped up in their states and districts, lavishing praise on them. So centrist Democrats refers to Democrats in Congress. And the efforts by these business lobby groups spending money on media, television, and social media, and radio, and other media to pressure, to mobilize public opinion within those Democratic constituencies and states to push these congressmen to oppose policies that threaten their interests, and to push them by persuading the voters in those districts that these policies being proposed by the Biden administration are bad and threaten their well-being and are going to cause them to lose jobs and are going to make them suffer economically. One of these campaign advertisements calls Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who has emerged as a leading holdout on the measure, an independent voice and a bipartisan leader. Keep in mind, these politicians, they live and breathe public opinion. They do not think a second without, they do not breathe without thinking about its impact on public opinion. They're always worried about the next elections, keeping their jobs by winning the next coming elections for primary nominee of their party to run the general election. So one of these advertisements calls Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who has emerged as a leading holdout on the measure, an independent voice and a bipartisan leader. Another says Representative Kurt Schrader of Oregon is pushing for the Biden-Schrader agenda, though he clearly opposes key portions of the president's package. A third praises Representative Kathleen Rice of New York for fighting for our health care and our economy, even if she undercuts elements of Mr. Biden's plan. As Democrats labor to keep Mr. Biden's proposal on track in Congress amid deep internal divisions, a robust influence campaign is meeting it at every turn. Business groups are working in overdrive to fight large swaths of it, such as raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations, expanding Medicare to cover dental, hearing, and vision services, and propose taxes and fees to cut down on carbon emissions. So Biden's plan has both social welfare policies to provide increased government guaranteed medical care for more people, since people cannot rely upon their employer to provide those benefits like they used to as much in the past because of a globalization of the American economy, right? So again, you want the best example of a globalized economy? You Belgian students, you're in it. South Korea. Look how South Korea organizes itself. It's got a national healthcare system. Everything is centralized. It's got, I mean, this is the best example of an economy that succeeds in globalization. And Americans, until recently, until the last few decades, have not believed or understood how their own economic well-being has a relationship to the global economy. And even though that has been there, they haven't seen it, but now they are seeing it and they're reacting in different ways. And some of them refuse to admit it. Other people are favoring it, but it's causing polarization. It's contributing to intense political polarization that people like Donald Trump exploit, claiming that it's social, that these programs are socialism and they threaten traditional American values. It goes on here. The effort is unfolding less conspicuously than previous lobbying pushes. Pandemic restrictions have limited large gatherings of lobbyists at the Capitol. So the corridor outside the Senate Finance Committee's office, which has long been known as Gucci Gulch, is no longer overrun with shiny Italian shoes. In other words, these lobbyists who are hired by these business groups to lobby and pressure these politicians, these congressmen and senators, they have lots of money, so they spend money on expensive shoes, like Gucci Italian shoes. So Gucci Gulch. But the campaign is proceeding as intensely as ever via individual meetings, Zoom calls, fundraisers, and the airwaves. In other words, broadcast radio and television media. More than 4,000 lobbyists are working on budget and spending issues, according to Open Secrets, a nonprofit watchdog group that tracks money in politics. 10 major industries have spent nearly $700 million this year on lobbying, the group said. And it goes on here. I'm not going to cover the domestic social welfare benefits. I'm going to talk about the focus here on the climate change issues. Building back together, A group formed to support the proposals of the Biden administration is part of a coalition that's committed to spending $150 million on advertising to build support for Mr. Biden's plan. The League of Conservation Voters has spent nearly $6.7 million on media, on advertising, right? On political advertising. $6.7 million this month on advertising, according to analytics firm Adlam Pact. It is urging Congress to cut carbon pollution in half by 2030 in 9 years. An element of the package in the Biden package, to cut carbon emissions by half in 9 years, and has threatened to withhold campaign donations from Democrats who do not support it. And so I'll go on here. And okay, so that's a lead into the foreign policy element of this. So let me then go back to that file, and I hopefully can find it here. And let me see if I can find that. Okay, so so it says you can see this. So you see here that John Kerry, this is from a couple weeks ago. John Kerry is a former US Senator. He was a senator in the United States Senate for many years, and he ran for president in 2004 against George W. Bush and lost. Then under Barack Obama from 2000, he was the Secretary of State for the US Foreign Minister under Barack Obama. And then, of course, Donald Trump became president. And then when Joe Biden became president, he named John Kerry as his representative for global climate change. So John Kerry, who was the former Secretary of State and former senator, is now representing the United States as the special representative of the United States for global climate change negotiations. It goes on here, Mr. Kerry's mission is further complicated by political fissures at home and the fact that President Biden's ambitious climate change agenda may not survive a divided Congress. Republican leaders argue that transitioning away from the fossil fuels that have underpinned the American economy for more than a century risks national security. And so you here is one Republican senator from Wyoming, which is a center for oil and gas and coal mining, the fossil fuel industry. John Kerry has been a disaster for a long time for our country, said John Barrasso of Wyoming, a member of Republican leadership and the top Republican on the Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee. There are ways that we can certainly protect the environment without hurting the economy. He apparently doesn't believe that. So, you know, Glasgow, in later this fall, there's going to be the meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Paris Accord to limit greenhouse gas emissions of all the states that have committed way back in the early 1990s are going to meet in Glasgow, Scotland, I think in November. And they're going to meet to discuss their plans to address global climate change. And Richard N. Haas, president of the Council of Foreign Relations, said signs don't portend well for Mr. Kerry's efforts in the looming UN summit in November in Glasgow, Scotland, for the climate change summit. Glasgow will come up short, he predicted. In other words, we're going to fail at Glasgow. We're not going to come up with enough changes or enough commitments to do what we need to do to address climate change. And still, Mr. Kerry pushes on. He plans to meet again with China's top climate diplomat, Xi Jinping. It will be the 19th discussion between the two men since January of this year, according to his staff. As part of the Paris Accord, countries agreed to restrain the increase in average global temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably by 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with temperatures before the Industrial Revolution. So that was what, 200 years ago, 250 years ago. For every fraction of a degree of warming, the world will see more frequent, intense, and deadly heat waves, wildfires, droughts, and floods, as well as species extinction. It mentioned here that John Kerry, when he was a senator from Massachusetts in Congress, he championed several environmental efforts that faced opposition and ultimately crumbled, including an effort to raise auto fuel economy standards in 2002 to change and require, in other words, the efficiency of American car manufacturers to burn less gasoline, to use less gasoline to generate less carbon, and a sweeping climate bill in 2010 that both failed. back in 2002 and then again in 2010. It notes here that Kerry initiated secret negotiations, including hosting Chinese leaders at a legal seafoods restaurant on the docks of Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, his home state. That laid the groundwork for a joint pledge in 2014 by the United States and China to cut emissions, albeit at different paces. The following year in Paris, nations took the unprecedented step of pledging climate action in their own countries, an accord that Mr. Kerry helped craft. So the United States pledged in 2015 to cut its emissions. And now they're going to meet after 4 years of Donald Trump, who came into office in 2017, to discuss what they're doing. So my question to you is, be honest. Remember, we're dealing with the future of human civilization, according to some people. Some people say if we don't control global climate fuel emissions and reduce carbon radically, drastically, now, not 50 years from now, within the next 9 years, cut it in half, that we will have major threat to human civilization. The human civilization itself may be at risk. Okay? So now that you've been very dramatic, let me ask you a question. Please respond to the statement. The Chinese authoritarian one-party state, not democracy, not separation of powers, not democratic elections, the Chinese authoritarian one-party state is better suited to provide global leadership to meet the Anthropocene global climate emergency. So Anthropocene is a Greek word. Anthro means human. So human era, human time, global climate emergency. That's how some people describe the current stage of the evolution of planet Earth. We're in the Anthropocene epoch, like the Pleistocene and the Jurassic and, Jurassic Park, like the film. We are now in the Anthropocene because the humans are changing the world through their actions and activity. Do you believe, how do you respond to the statement? The Chinese authoritarian one-party state is better suited to provide global leadership to meet the Anthropocene global climate emergency. Remember, Richard Haas says, we're going to come up short at Glasgow. So let me divide you into groups and say we'll divide into 3 groups and just assign you randomly. And okay, so there's the groups. And so join those groups, join those 3 groups that you've been randomly assigned to. And join those groups and tell me where your group fits on this scale. Be honest now. Be honest. We only have 9 years to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by half. And that's just to prevent the worst effects of climate change. It's too late to stop the climate change, right? There's too much carbon in the air. Even if we cut global carbon emissions by half in 9 years, from now, we're still going to have the world temperature increase by 1.5 degrees. And that's going to cause, it already is causing, more intense hurricanes and typhoons, more frequent hurricanes and typhoons, more flooding, more droughts, more wildfires, more extreme weather, more economic and human suffering as poor people, because the poor are always vulnerable, become even more vulnerable, leading to droughts and catastrophes in Africa and Latin America, and more people desperately trying to get to Europe, Belgium, United States, to try to find a way to live because they can't farm in their home because there's a drought and they're so poor. Is China's model what the human race needs at this time to deal with this first of its kind global emergency due to human-caused climate change? Is it better than the American model with its lobbying and its business interests and its short-sighted lobbying by different lobby groups saying, oh, I don't care, I want to protect my oil industry because it's my interest. Do you need a one-party state in order to organize and push society to do what needs to be done to transform the economy, rather than this American system of short-sighted, myopic interest groups lobbying to protect what they have, even though what they have is threatening the world. So where does your group fit on this scale? Be honest. Be honest. And I will also choose, hopefully, heads is strongly agree, or agree or strongly agree. So what's Admiral Lee going to tell me to do? And it's strongly agree. Okay, so I'm going to write a strongly agree statement. Okay. Okay. So who's going to speak for each group first? So let me go back to the breakout rooms, and heads, it's the first person in each group. And it's heads. Okay, so let me close all the rooms. This is like a science fiction novel, trying to imagine what the future will be like with intensifying global climate change and intensifying natural disasters. How will China, America, Europe, and all the other countries of the world respond to these intensifying disasters and crises that climate change multiplies and intensifies, these crises and disasters? Okay, so Ido-hee, for room 1, where does your group fit on the scale?
In this topic, we choose the disagree about 1.
Oh yeah?
Yes,
Why?
we think that.
Go ahead.
Yes. We think that a one-party system have a problem that they can monopolize the power, and in this way, the people's opinion are not communicated, and also only politicians deal with the environmental issue. So I also think the Chinese is the most huge exporting country in Asia. So sometimes they can make like air pollution or water pollutions or dust in the process, and it's still problem in the world. And also I think even though it's not Chinese, one party's data system, it's not good for to deal with the global climate emergency.
You know, I mean, first off, you know, we keep comparing China with the United States. Let's keep in mind, China is still a poor country. It's the second biggest economy in the world. But when you divide the size of its economy by the size of the population, it's still a poor country. So we're asking an awful lot of the Chinese to provide global leadership for meeting global climate change when they're still a poor country. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, China was desperately poor. Mao Zedong was still alive. I remember when Mao Zedong died, when it was announced after the Cultural Revolution. I remember when Deng Xiaoping began the reform efforts in China in the late 1970s. It wasn't that long ago where they were a desperately poor country. Now, 40, 50 years later, they're doing better. 40 years later, 45 years later, but they're still a poor country. But, you know, we keep comparing China and the US. They're competing for global leadership. Oh, is China going to maintain and undertake its responsibilities? You know, I mean, they don't have the money that the US has yet. I mean, so we're going to ask them, no, you have to stop burning coal. Oh, okay. I mean, they're trying, but should we really hold China to the same standards as the United States? Not to mention India, which is 1/5 the size of the Chinese economy. We're going to tell them, oh, you can't burn coal. You have to do solar and gas and wind and the Indians and other countries say, okay, yes, but you have to help us, America. You have to put out some money. You have to help us develop these alternative forms of energy. We have coal in the ground. We're not supposed to use that coal. Well, what are we supposed to use? You're saying we have to build more solar and wind. Well, maybe. I don't know how much you can rely just upon solar and wind to power your economy and develop your poor country. I mean, you want nuclear? Okay, well then let's accept the fact that we have to build a lot more nuclear reactors. We have to build a lot more nuclear reactors. And that means not just for India, but all of the countries of the world, including Iran, including Pakistan, including everybody. But the Americans get nervous about, you know, about developing nuclear technology out of fear that their enemies might develop nuclear weapons with it. But so you disagree. Okay, let me tell you something, by the way, before I forget, because I'll forget. You know, the Korean Political Science Association had its World Congress. Every 2 years, the Korean Political Science Association has a World Congress, and that was in August of this year. And I attended one panel. Everything was on Zoom. Everything was virtual. And it was, of course, many of the panels were in English. And one person who was attending, I think it was a Korean professor, said, China is consistently among the top countries the top 3 or 4 countries in terms of the expressed levels of social trust that Chinese people have in the society around them. So Chinese people expect that other Chinese within Chinese society, that they can trust them to carry out their promises, to carry out their contracts. In other words, even though this is a one-party state that rules with police and can be quite brutal and cruel, it is a society in which Chinese people believe that they can trust other Chinese, including other Chinese that are in power locally and beyond, to do what they promised to do. They said China's consistently within the top 3 or 4 countries in terms of level of societal trust, according to research by political scientists. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the Communist Party in China has a great degree of success in maintaining its authority in that country. If Chinese people think that I live in a world in which I can trust other Chinese to do what they should do in treating me, and I will treat them right and they will treat me correctly, that tells you this is a world in which people believe that there are commonly shared rules and roles, institutions, rules and roles that we all know, and we all know what we should do. And we do it. Even though they don't have democracy in China, even though it's a one-party state, even though there's censoring of the internet. And I think that's really significant, because that tells me that this one-party state, the authorities of China have a great degree of authority in China. They don't rule primarily by fear and terror. That's not how they keep control in China. People obey the law because they think they should in China. And that's because that goes back to your point about the will of the people and expressing the will of people and knowing what the people want. Somehow the Chinese Communist Party is able to reflect what the Chinese people want or shape what they want. Because that's what the people state about, observers state about the pandemic, that to deal successfully with the pandemic and to deal also more generally with these climate crises, you need leadership. There needs to be effective leadership. And who has the more effective leadership model? China or the United States? Where you have polarization in the United States, white nationalist conflict with other groups, as represented by Donald Trump. I mean, that Donald Trump, he won an election, for God's sake, in the United States. That demagogue, that incipient fascist, he won an election in the United States. What does that tell you about the American model in dealing with these emerging crises and emergencies that the human race is facing? Okay, so let's go to the second group and breakout room. Elisa.
Hello. So we actually agreed. We think that one party government will actually be able to make decisions much quicker.
You agree?
Yeah. But we do worry about like the unethical behavior about it. But
can I talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So we actually agreed because the experts of climate change say that it is a very something that needs to be done quickly. And in our opinion, we looked at the one-party states, and we think this is better suited to provide a global solution quickly. So we were rather thinking of that, about that a one-party state, even though we are afraid of what they will decide, there will be a solution quicker because they are a one-party state, and because of the bureaucracy in the US, for example, it will take a far more long time. And this way, the climate change will maybe more provide in the worst case.
I don't know. I don't think the bureaucracy is the problem in the United States, because the bureaucracy would be quite willing to provide the leadership to enforce, to carry out change. They would like to have more control and influence over American society. I think the point is that these interest groups, these private interest groups, that they are, if you're a rich, powerful person in America, you don't have to worry about climate change. So what? There's more hurricanes. How is that going to affect you if you're a billionaire? If you're a billionaire in the United States, or a millionaire, a multimillionaire, how is that going to affect you? You don't have to worry about these effects of climate change on your life, right? So, who's going to suffer from climate change? The people that are already the most vulnerable, the poor people who live in the flood-prone areas, because they live in flood-prone areas where there's a territory and land that is prone to flooding, because land is cheap there, housing is cheap. So they move there because it's prone to flood, and it'll flood more. It's not your typical American that's going to suffer. It's going to suffer. So what? There's a drought, and the price of bread goes up 1,000 won for a loaf of bread. Does that affect me if I have to pay 1,000 won more for a loaf of bread, or €1 more for a loaf of bread? Not so much, but it might affect somebody who's already poor. And, Americans might say, well, poor people, who cares? They're poor because they're bad. And that's a topic from the American history class. But I mean, you see that. I mean, this lack of concern for the common good among people that are core Trump supporters. But there isn't this, and it goes back to American culture, that there's a relatively weak consideration or willingness to accept this notion that there's a common collective good that we have to be concerned about. What counts is me, not the global good. You take care of yourself and I'll take care of myself. Thank you very much. But China's a different place, right? Asia's a different place. And this is why it's a critical moment in world development, not just American development. Can the United States do what it needs to do to radically transform its economy away from fossil fuels when they've been relying upon these for over 100 years, and they have adopted policies over that 100 years by the US Congress and the US government in general to support, develop, and maintain fossil fuel infrastructure? Now, in 9 years, you're supposed to radically transform that. And you see these Senator Barrasso from Wyoming. I mean, nobody lives in Wyoming. There's only like 600,000 people that live in a whole state in Wyoming. 600,000 people. And it's heavily dependent upon mining and farming, but particularly mining, coal mining, oil, ranching. One of the big sources of climate change gas is agriculture, to produce beef, and particularly beef, bulgogi, beef, right? And Wyoming is the center of beef production and coal production. And you see, Senator Barrasso, he might be a smart guy. I think he used to be a college professor, but he knows what he needs to say to keep his job. That means to win elections and not be defeated by his opponents, other ambitious politicians who want to take his job, including in the Republican Party, as also in the general election. So he says, oh no, we don't need to get away with fossils. No, because if he even appears to threaten fossil fuel interests, he's out in the next election. So Biden administration, the US presidency and executive branch is supposed to trick Americans so that we all know that this is what's going on, what I just described, but the Biden administration is supposed to satisfy Barroso while at the same time doing something else in order to really reduce. What is he supposed to do? I mean, you have to cut back on the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry that have been in place in the United States law and policies for over 100 years. Can they do it? Can Biden do it now in October 2021? I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, they show that they can make people do what they don't want to do. When the Chinese Communist Party, even in this poor country, states, we need to reduce pollution, do it. And they do it in China. It's not pleasant. It causes much suffering, like with the Wuhan, with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. They locked down that entire city of what, 10 million people. They locked it down. You could not leave your apartment. If you did, you'd be arrested. It didn't matter if you didn't have any food. It didn't matter if you needed medical care. You may not leave the apartment, your home. And they put that in place for a month. And people suffered and died. But they dealt with the virus. They've inoculated what did I read a few weeks ago? The Chinese claim that they have delivered 1.6 billion doses of virus vaccine. That was a month ago. Maybe not maybe not the best vaccine, not the Pfizer BioNTech, and not the EAZ, AstraZeneca, and not the Moderna, Chinese vaccines that are not as effective. But everybody's been vaccinated in China with the Chinese vaccines. Everybody, 1.4 billion people. Okay. The next group.
But what do you then actually think of the one party state being better?
Well, at a time of national emergency and global emergency, if that's what we're in, during a time of national emergency, democracy often suffers. And so I wrote, strongly agree. The American democratic system does not work successfully in a time of global and national emergency. I predict the United States executive branch will declare a national emergency, and the executive branch will rule by decree to address the consequences of climate change, with the US Defense Department and the national security establishment assuming more and more control over the US economy. Meanwhile, the European Union will develop further its own capacities to distance itself from NATO, because the United States will become more and more unreliable. And so the European Union will have to develop its own military capacities to take care of its own security needs in conjunction with China and Russia, in order to address the emergencies emerging from global climate change. I mean, polarization in the United States is going to continue. Donald Trump is still the most powerful person in the Republican Party. It looks like he's going to run for president again in 2024. I don't think he's going to win, but he dominates the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is probably going to take control over at least one house of Congress next year in the elections. Unless something amazing happens, I think the Republican Party is going to take control of the House or the Senate or both. I mean, the Democrats only have like an 8-seat majority in the House of Representatives, and it's 50-50 split in the Senate. And the party that controls the presidency almost always loses seats in the Congress in the midterm elections between the elections for president. So we had elections in 2020 for president. The Congress elections are happening in 2022. And the party that controls the White House almost always suffers some loss. So the Republicans are going to come back in power in at least one House of Congress in January 2023. Because of the elections will be in November 2022, and then a new Congress comes in January 2023. So we all know this. I know it, you know it, the whole world knows this. So the Biden administration is supposed to ram this through now and get it done and get everything fixed now, and then know that in November of next year, they're going to lose control of the Congress. And those Democrats that supported Biden in the House or in the Senate that supported the Biden administration, they're going to lose their jobs. Maybe they know they're going to lose their jobs. You wonder, what is the Biden administration promising Kyrsten Sinema? Remember, she's that senator from Arizona who's a Democrat who represents a state that is balanced between Republicans and Democrats. What is he promising her if she votes to support his policies? Is she going to be, if she loses the election, is she going to be given some kind of a job? Maybe be appointed ambassador or appointed a department secretary? What is he promising her? To commit, political harakiri, seppuku, to kill herself politically, to vote this month in favor of his programs. What is Joe Biden saying or promising Joe Manchin of West Virginia, the senator from West Virginia, which is also heavily into coal production? What is he going to promise him to get him to vote to support these radical, these transformational energy policies? Knowing that, he believes, if he supports Biden's programs, he will probably lose election, and nobody likes to lose. I hate losing. You hate losing. It's humiliating. And you go down in history as a loser. Loser. So what are you going to give him? What are you going to give West Virginia? What are you going to give Arizona? That will maybe to convince West Virginia voters to support Joe Manchin, even if Joe Manchin agrees to undercut or reduce subsidies, U.S. policy, government tax subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. What are you going to give West Virginia? That's the kind of discussion going on right now to get that Biden has to carry out to get these policies through the Congress this month before the Glasgow meeting in November. And I don't know. Okay, so Anais, what did your group decide? Anais, Moose?
Yes, we chose neutral because while we think that China would make order listen, such as with the example you gave during locking down town during COVID. Yeah, so China, it will mean that China will have a monopoly on the new sector, and we are not sure how other countries would react to this.
As global climate change intensifies, continues, there are going to be more and more disasters. More and more, as I said, floods, hurricanes, and typhoons that are more frequent, more deadly. So if you're a poor country like Indonesia or Philippines, if you're Philippines, you already get hit by typhoons. Now you're going to get hit by more typhoons. And you're poor already. Your country's poor and you want to develop. What model who are you going to look to provide answers and resources for your country? The Americans? The Americans don't want any more immigrants. 100 million people live in Philippines. Lots of Filipinos go to work in America. But then you see the rise of Donald Trump saying, we don't want any more immigrants. We don't want any more people coming from non-white countries. China needs immigrants. China's got it's got a problem with not producing enough children because of the government impositions so, you already see under Duterte in Philippines, they already started looking more and more to China. They got their vaccines from China. They didn't wait for the US vaccines. There's already seems to be some kind of movement in Philippines and Indonesia already to looking towards China more and more. And of course, in return for getting support and aid from China, China expects Philippines and Indonesia and any country to give them something back. Wow. Well, we'll see. The problem is, in the US, for example, during the Cold War, the United States administration did mobilize, the executive branch of the United States did mobilize the resources of the United States to fight the Cold War against the supposed Russian version of Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union was supposedly a Russian version of Nazi Germany, and the American executive branch government became very, very big and very, very powerful and had lots of authority to act anywhere around the world, wherever the evil empire attempted to expand through its conspiratorial plans to expand world communism. But in global climate change, who's the bad guy? Who are you going to blame? who can you target as being the source of threat? You're going to blame China? China's not the problem. I mean, China's not, I mean, they might look for a threat. And you see that in the American political institutions today, that China, 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 China. Are they going to really look for China, make China the scapegoat, make China the target by which the American executive branch, the American president, then mobilizes America's nationalism and America's national resources through nationalism to coordinate, to adopt radical policies that, by the way, happen to transform the economy away from fossil fuels? So you see the Americans, they want to create their own economic resources that do not rely upon Chinese production. I mean, I can imagine that kind of situation continuing to develop, but how is that going to lead the Americans to reduce their reliance on the fossil fuel industry? The subsidies for the oil and gas and coal industry, the US government has given them through tax breaks, not taxing them, different ways that they have done that for 100 years. How are they going to stop doing that? By blaming China, while scapegoating China. I mean, I'm having difficulty understanding that. Maybe, again, it's like you see more and more of the world moving towards indirect competition. With nuclear weapons in 1945 being dropped on Japan, clearly the world powers in competition with each other, the United States with the Soviet Union, focused more and more of their competition for influence on indirect forms of competition, trying to appeal to the rest of the world or to control the rest of the world through intervention, which is not really so successful today, as you see how the United States has failed in Afghanistan. So how are you going to try to appeal to and for influence and compete successfully for influence around the rest of the world in 2021? And it's got to be indirect appeals in the forms of who can offer the best development model for poor countries like Indonesia or People's Republic of Congo or Mozambique or Angola or Philippines or Myanmar. Who can offer, or Cambodia, who can offer the best model for developing those poor countries that are already poor, that want to develop, and now they have to deal with global climate change, which is causing even more difficulties for development, with more disasters, more costly disasters. Who offers the best model, America or China? And my bet is, of course, and this is what the Chinese are arguing, that their model is the best. Like Myanmar, like Philippines, like Indonesia, Chinese claim, we know what it's like to be a post-colonial state. We know what it's like to be poor and exploited and oppressed when we were weak and exploited by the Japanese and the British and the Russians. We know what that's like. And look what we have done, Indonesia. Look what we Chinese have done, Filipinos. Look what we have done. We have developed our country, and we can do the same for you if you work with us. Your countries in Africa, your countries in Southeast Asia, work with us, and we will help you do in your countries what we have done in China. And that means a one-party state. Stop listening to this American BS about elections when it produces a Trump. Work with us. And, it's working in Cambodia. Cambodia is all in on China, right? Myanmar seems to be committed to China. I told you, Indonesia and Philippines are working closely with China. They got their vaccines from China. The first vaccines were from China. I mean, China is the biggest investor in Africa, not the Americans, not the French, not the British, not the Portuguese. China was the biggest investor in Africa. I think by far. China's investing in Venezuela, along with Russia. And if the Biden administration does not deliver this month before the Glasgow conference next month in November, it's going to make the Chinese model look even more appealing. Because everybody knows what I've been saying here, that Trump is still there. And Trump is the most powerful person in the Republican Party. And Trump is not going away. And even if Trump does go away, the forces that produce Trump are still there in America. Okay, so anyone else? Let me see who else has got a chance to speak. Gilles, anything to add?
Nothing in particular. I agree with my group's previous statement that we're against the one-party system controlling the climate change. At first, I was thinking, yes, maybe a one-party system would be good in having a quick resolution in decision-making. But after having a conversation with my teammates, I readjusted my first opinion to be in contra, because it would be too dangerous to have a one party to make a decision that is so globally determining of the future for the rest of our lives. So it would be better to have a proper discussion than making a quick and easy solution, which may or may not result in a very, very bad future.
And what about Kang Tong-Hoon Sally? Have you changed your mind?
No, I same with my group. Can I tell my opinion?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think it's appropriate for China, because China doesn't show their accurate economic indicators. So I think I think China is not appropriate to become a leader in.
Well, I mean, they're not doing too badly. I mean, like I said, I mean, their economy is growing rapidly. Okay. And someone else who hasn't spoken, Kim Eugene. I think Kim already spoke. Kim Eugene, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I'm also agree as my teammates said. Thinking about the bureaucracy, it takes pretty much time, and I think we have to focus about the topic, which is the climate change, and since is happening rapidly, we have to take we should not wait more and take action as soon as possible.
I mean, that's what the Chinese leadership is saying. A democracy, look at what American democracy has produced. More polarization, more conflict as people like Trump exploit racism to mobilize his voters among the white core in America, among Black and marginalized communities in America, claiming and complaining about white supremacy and systemic racism. Democracy produces more conflict, more intense polarization, more hatred, more weakness, more dysfunction. We don't want democratic elections. No, thank you. No, thank you. Particularly when we need unity and action. This is like the equivalent of wartime now. If we have to transform our economy in 9 years, I mean, 9 years is nothing. I mean, I've been here in Korea 12 years. 9 years is nothing. Again, what I'm saying, everybody knows. It's not a secret. And so I think what's going to happen is that Joe Biden and the Congress is going to come up with some kind of plan, and they're going to pass a plan. But how are they going to adopt policies to radically transform the US economy away from fossil fuels? I mean, it would be a first. It would be the first time we have seen such a rapid transformation of the economy since World War II. It'd be equivalent of what happened during World War II. when the American economy mobilized to fight that war.
Isn't it then also the question that if Trump would be reelected, that what would Trump do? Would he again drop out of the climate change because he doesn't believe in the system?
Yeah, I
because
mean,
then again,
if
the
he gets
spiral
reelected,
starts
yeah.
again.
If he gets reelected, but I don't think he's going to get reelected. People know what this guy is like, right? So anybody who thought, well, let's try Donald Trump and see, something different. Well, now they know what they got. So the news reporting states that Trump's got support about 45% of the electorate, but it's not going to go any higher. So you're going to have election outcomes that are like what happened in 2020, that he'll get about 45% of the vote, and that's it. Because the other 55% of the Americans are going to say, there's no way we're voting for him again. He will win. He could win the nomination for president, because that's just primary Republican voters voting just among Republicans, because he dominates the Republican Party. So he may win the nomination, but I doubt that he's going to win the general election if it's against Biden or against somebody else in the Democratic Party.
Even if it's not really realistic, if he would win, what do you think he would do with the climate change, and what would happen after that?
I think, he's going to act like a rich guy. We don't care what happens to poor people. If you're rich or even somewhat middle class, you don't have to worry about climate change. You're not the one that's going to suffer from flooding. You're not the one that's going to suffer from increased pollution. You're not the one that's got to deal with that. It'll be like, there's just more and more natural disasters. And, God makes these things, and, some people pay and some people don't. You should take care of yourself and stop expecting socialism and the government to take care of you. That's the mindset of the Trump supporter. They even deny that climate change is happening due to human activity. Or even if they accept it, they say there's no way that the human race can cooperate to address it. We're not going to stop the Chinese and the Indians and so on. So just ignore it. Just ignore it. Yeah, more wildfires. Well, you chose to build your beautiful house out in the beautiful countryside of California in the woods. You want to be up there. That's your choice. It's not like the wildfires in California are something new. They've been there forever. You chose to live there. It's your choice. So I don't want to hear about we got to, transform our economy because of wildfires in California or Australia. But but they might well take control over one house of Congress, and that means that the U.S. government will not be able to act after January 2023. They have to do it now, before if they're going to take radical action. And some Democrats, and so they're probably going to adopt some kind of policy, but it's not going to go far enough. To reduce greenhouse gases by 50% in 9 years. Unless, you promise some amazing things to some of these centrist Democrats who, they don't want to lose elections. I mean, why do I have to commit political suicide? Why me, Joe Manchin? I have to commit political suicide for the greater good. Who else is going to, commit political suicide for the greater good? And besides, if I lose election, who's going to replace me? A Republican. He's a Democrat. Kirsten Sinema is saying the same thing. If I lose re-election, a Republican is going to replace me. So don't ask me to do too much, Joe Biden. And, Europe is more like China in this regard, because the Europeans, and this is the topic for the American history course I'm teaching, the Europeans, like the Chinese and Asia, they have a tradition of this notion of it's called an organic metaphor of society. That society is a collective whole. That society is like a human body, right? That each of the parts are essential to the functioning of the body, and they work together to produce something that's more than just a heart and a brain and a gut and a liver and lungs. You bring them all together and you have a human being. But each has to do their part, and each has an obligation to the other parts to create the body politique. And the Yangban, the aristocrats, are the brain, represented by the monarch in the aristocratic class. And I'm a worker, so I'm like one part of the body. You're a burger, a bourgeoisie, you're another part of the body. The Europeans and the Asians that have this tradition that comes from feudalism. But the Americans were founded by America was founded by radical individualists who rejected this notion of a greater good. I only care about me. And the greater good is bad because the greater good is used as a justification for suppressing me and keeping me down. The only way you get around that in America is if you talk about we have to fight a war, like during the World War II or the Cold War that lasted 40 years. Okay, so Jaewon Kim.
At first, I was close to number 2, agree, because Chinese one-party state is much more good. One-party state is much more quicker and easier to draw out the solution. But now I'm close to neutral because the China wasn't a good example.
Yeah.
Wasn't a good example to give a positive impact to the global climate change.
Okay. And Nikita.
And so I mainly looked at it from both aspects. I think, yes, it is good that there's one totalitarian state that can implement the solution pretty quickly, but then you have to look at it at a certain point. So there are a lot of these private groups that are these business groups that can be affected because maybe they're invested into oil or they're invested into something else, and China can, if they really want to, implement something that really hurts the economy to other countries but helps theirs. But they just gonna say, oh, this is for the global, for the global need of the humans and the global economy and the global climate. So therefore, you don't have to look at it at that aspect of the economy, but maybe they have ill intent, like increasing theirs instead of others, so they have more power.
Yeah, I mean, we don't believe in Santa Claus, right? Nobody gives us anything for free. You never get anything in this world for free. So if China's gonna give countries assistance, they expect something back. And that includes, recognizing that Taiwan is not a sovereign state. That China's claim to the South China Sea are going to be accepted. And, that's just the way the world works. So, okay, we'll see. We'll have a test here. I just am imagining, that if the world, global climate change is happening, it cannot be stopped. The question is, can it be reduced? Can it be kept to 1.5 degrees? And that's going to be more and more droughts, floods, migration, and who's going to deal with this most effectively? And there will be more polarization and conflict over these issues. We'll have to see. I'm trying to think through it myself in terms of what to expect from this, but it's hard to foresee. But now, it's a critical time in the U.S. government system. So, all right. So let me go back to the share screen and share the screen and go back to vote. And it says, of course, sign me out, log in, and we're going to pop up with all the stupid stuff here. Click that, close that down. Go back to American foreign policy, go to vote. And okay, so please vote. I think you can see that, right? Make sure you can vote on this topic of whether or not the Chinese authoritarian one-party state is better suited to provide global leadership to meet the Anthropocene global climate emergency. So you have 15 seconds. Okay.
Gilles is still doing it. Oh, he got it. Okay.
Okay. All right. So we will see what happens. So let me open up the notes for this week from the book. And so let me go to documents and US foreign policy and chapter 5, US Congress and foreign policy. And so make sure I can share the screen there so you can see that. And okay. So this, again, this book was written at the beginning, was published before the full impact of the Trump administration foreign policy. So CUK is writing after the first couple of years of the Trump administration. He's writing, this is before everything that happened over the last 2 years. The United States strategic partners are once again recently reminded the US is an unreliable and unpredictable ally. Although the influence of the US president over the US foreign policy has steadily increased, the US Congress can obstruct it. So, for example, I mean, again, these politicians in the Congress, like the president, they're always thinking about the next elections. Anything they do is trying to influence the outcome of the next elections, both the party primary elections and the general elections. There's 2 elections. And in the primary elections, for Republican Party nominee in the general election, the Democratic Party nominee in the general election, those tend to be dominated by those groups that are, those individuals who are more militant, those citizens who pay more close attention to politics and foreign policy, and therefore tend to be more ideologically hard or committed to particular worldviews, people who are more militant in their outlooks and political behaviors. So, you know, John Boehner, who was the leader of the House when the Republicans dominated the House of Representatives, he was the Speaker of the House. And he invited Benjamin Netanyahu, who was Prime Minister of Israel, to come speak to a joint session of Congress without informing the US President Barack Obama, who had a conflict with Benjamin Netanyahu over Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. So Boehner invited this person to come speak to a joint session of Congress over the opposition of President Obama, the President of the United States, the Democratic President of the United States, Barack Obama. And he opposed the Obama administration and now the Biden administration's efforts to negotiate a nuclear program agreement with the Iranians to stop Iran from developing the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. Netanyahu thought it wasn't firm enough and strong enough, and the Obama administration wanted to compromise with Iran and keeping some elements of its nuclear program. Netanyahu called on Congress to place more sanctions on Iran, not less, and so that shows you this division of powers and authority in the United States. And if one of the houses of Congress come under Republican control in next November 2022 elections, you're going to see this happen again, that the Republicans will repeatedly try to embarrass President Biden in many ways, including in foreign policy. So US President Obama was embarrassed before the world. So legislative politics, the US Congress, keep in mind, about 90% of the US Congress people keep their jobs after every election. There's not about 90%, it says here, longevity. Members of the Congress are more likely than ever to make their professional careers in the legislative branch. So once they get elected, they tend to stay there. They know what they need to do to keep their jobs. Since the 1950s, more than 80% of people that are in the Congress have been reelected. So they generally think they know how they need to behave to win the primary election and the next following the general election. Then they will acquire seniority, including promotions into more powerful positions on congressional committees that they select. So they tend to be, so the work of the Congress is done in committees. It's a real functioning, important body in the US policymaking process. This is in contrast, for example, to the House of Commons in Britain. The House of Commons is more for show. It's more for public debate. It's more for spectacle. The House of Commons in Britain is controlled by the government. That's why Boris Johnson is prime minister, is because he controls how a majority of the House of Commons members vote. So in other words, the House of Commons doesn't have autonomy. The House of Commons committees, they do what Boris Johnson tells them to do within limits. But because of separation of powers, the committees in the US Congress are more important. And congressmen join the different committees, the Finance Committee, the Armed Services Committee. There are many different committees in the Congress, depending upon what they think is most important to their voters in their district, their constituency that they represent. So if you're from Wyoming, you're a congressman from Wyoming, and there's only one congressman from Wyoming because, as I said, there's only 600,000 people live there. You're going to be probably on the mining committee because mining is so important for Wyoming. So you're going to be on the committee in the Congress, in the House, that is focused on mining rules and regulations, because your economy of Wyoming and the voters' interests are so focused on that. If you have lots of military bases in your state or your district, you are probably going to want to be on the committees of the House and the Senate that oversee the military, because that's so important to your voters back home in your district. And you know what? You are probably going to want to get more money coming in to your military bases. And so you're not going to want to cut the military budget, as we covered in the previous class, right? A month ago, we talked about how the US Congress, controlled by the Democrats, added another $24 billion onto the US Defense Department budget request, more than the Biden administration requested. They didn't cut the budget, they increased it, the military budget, even after they won the election in last year. Why? Because congressmen know what they need to do to get reelected. And this goes back to the fossil fuel industry. You know, if you're going to agree to cut fossil fuel subsidies that the US tax code provides for West Virginia coal companies or Wyoming coal companies, you are going to cut your own political throat.
Are these committees represented by by both parties, or is it like equally or not?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. You know, so there's a majority in the House that's Democratic, and so that means on these committees, the Democrats typically have one more seat on the committee, on any committee, than the Republicans do. If the Republicans become a majority, take control of majority of the House of Representatives in next November elections, then the Republican Party member will be the chairperson of that committee. Right now, a Democrat is the chairperson of the committee. But it's like so close. There's only like one Democrat more on the committee than Republican. And that, of course, that means a Democrat member of the party is the chairperson of that committee. And so, you know, the chairperson does most of the work, not all the work, but most of it. And so, you know, again, so what are you going to offer to these congressmen and women in Wyoming and West Virginia to agree to accept a reduction in subsidies for fossil fuel industry? They won't accept it. If you're a Republican, you're going to say no. You're going to have the Democrats. You want Joe Manchin? Let's focus on West Virginia. He's a senator from West Virginia. West Virginia is a center of coal. I mean, I'm just imagining what kind of negotiations they're having with this guy. Like, what are they offering him? There's not an absence of precedence for this. So remember, we talked about Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy 60 years ago when John F. Kennedy was killed and Lyndon Johnson became president. The Cold War is happening. Lyndon Johnson increases US forces in Vietnam. And there was this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for global public opinion support and influence around the world. And this American oppression and abuse of Black people was a real problem for America's competition for influence around the world during the Cold War in the 1960s. So Lyndon Johnson, because he also wanted to support ending oppression and abuse of Black people, passed lots of legislation through the US Congress that was controlled by the Democratic Party by big majorities after that 1964 election we covered at the last class. Remember the Daisy commercial? Boom. The Democratic Party got big majorities in the Senate and the House. And Lyndon Johnson passed lots of legislation as president, Democratic president, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1965, and other legislation. And he got that through this with these big majorities, but he had to overcome opposition still from the southern states where the racism was strongest. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you go look at where lots of these space research facilities that were created during the space race to go to the moon first, to beat the Soviet Union and show you Koreans and Belgians and Chileans and Brazilians, that the American system is the best because we got to the moon the first in 1969. These space bases, you find they're all concentrated in the American South, in Alabama, in Texas, in Florida. And it's not a coincidence because that's what Johnson gave to these Southern senators who he was asking for them for at least not to fight so hard against what he wanted, or maybe even to get their support, saying, look, I will put the new space research bases and institutions in your states to develop new economies to be 21st century global economy, right? So is Joe Biden doing something similar now with Manchin? What is he promising Manchin? Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia. What is he going to replace? You know, I mean, so that's what has to happen. That if you're going to agree that, look, Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, you know, global climate change is happening. We have to stop emitting carbon. We have to do it. Now, I know you want to get reelected. Tell me what you want and what you need from me, Joe Biden, in terms of new policies, new institutions, new research, new infrastructure, new facilities that the federal government can build in your state in return for you agreeing, or at least not opposing so much my policies to reduce fossil fuels. That's the kind of discussions that are going on right now. So, I mean, it's interesting. You think about the space program, you know, it's so great and cool. You go to the United States, you see these space research institutions and laboratories, they're all located in the American South because Lyndon Johnson made a deal with these senators from the heart of the old Confederacy that fought the Civil War to keep slavery. You guys, if you cooperate, I'm giving you this. So that's what I think has to happen. That's got to be part of the equation in terms of what's going to happen over the next few weeks. If you're going to transform the US economy, you've got to give something to these coal and oil and gas states. Give them something new. And I just don't know if Biden can do it, if he can give them enough. So longevity, polarization and party unity. Congressmen tend to be more ideologically rigid than a typical US citizen because, you know, the people that pay attention to politics tend to be more ideological, right? People that pay attention to politics more closely, they tend to be people that have strong views. And that, of course, refers to Congress people as well. So Congress people vote according to their party's official position at record levels in recent years. And again, Trump dominates the Republican Party. As a result, during divided government, relatively little federal legislation is approved. So if the Republicans take control of the House or the Senate or both next 14 months from now, well, actually January is when they come into office. So December, January. So 16 months from now, if they take control over one house, that's it, stops. There's not really going to be anything new going on in terms of new radical far-reaching laws passed by the US government. That's not going to happen. It has to happen now. In public discontent, as a consequence of the increasing polarization of party unity, the US public has expressed deep unhappiness with the performance of Congress. This unhappiness is extended to the presidency and the political parties. Keep in mind, this book is written before the end of the Trump presidency with the January 6th riots and everything. So things have just gotten more intense since Professor Hook completed his book. So trends in legislative executive relations. During the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s, there was a consensus existed between the White House and the Congress on the perceived danger from the Soviet Union and the need to engage in global containment. So are we going to have that now to deal with climate change? I just don't think so. I can't, unless you can put a face on it like China is causing global climate change. China's evil. But I don't see how that's going to be feasible. I mean, I can see trends moving in that direction. But again, how is that going to make the Americans transform their fossil fuel and get away from fossil fuels? But then the Vietnam debacle, the Vietnam War and its failure, that broke the consensus. That the Americans, a lot of Americans, not most, but a big majority of Americans began to doubt the Congress and the presidency in terms of believing what they were told by their elected officials. And that's become even more intense over the last year, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the absence of a unifying common perceived external threat led to more conflict between the Clinton administration and the Republican-controlled Congress that came into office in 1994. And then there was a brief reestablishment of bipartisan cooperation after the September 11, 2001 attacks, and Congress approved the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I mean, the US Congress gave incredible power to President Bush to do whatever he wanted to do to fight the global war on terror. They passed, after the September 11, 2001 attacks, the Authorization of Military Use of Force Act. Here it is. I have it here somewhere. Where is it? Darn it, let me see if I can call this up here. I want to show you what the law that they passed. Oh yeah, here it is. So open this up. This was passed by the US Congress to basically allow the president to do whatever the president thought was necessary to do to fight the terrorists. This was passed on September 18, 2001. Short document. That's it. Whereas on September 11, 2001, acts of treacherous violence were committed against the United States. On the basis of this use of military force authorization, they've been bombing Somalia, bombing Pakistan, using drones, bombs. This is what they used to invade Afghanistan. Whereas such acts render it both necessary and appropriate that the United States exercises its rights to self-defense and to protect the United States citizens both at home and abroad. Resolved by the Senate and the House that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, and persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided in the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, and persons. So on the basis of this short statement, Bush, Obama, Trump have bombed and killed in many different countries because it's part of the global war on terrorism and those groups that harbor and support the people that attacked the United States on September 11, 2001. And so there is some push by Democratic members of Congress to revoke this authorization, but they haven't done it yet. And I think Biden is too busy to get this revoked anyway. But this is what the Congress has done. It's told the president, whatever you think you need to do it. So much for congressional oversight. So let me go back to the notes. And see if I can find those notes. What did I do with the notes? Oh no. Okay, so back to the notes. So so now, of course, then Trump decided to negotiate to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan. He negotiated with the Taliban without bothering to consult with the Afghan government in Kabul. He promised to get out by May 2001. Biden won the election in November 2020, and he agreed to get out by September 11 in return for the Taliban not attacking U.S. forces. They left by the end of August, and the Afghanistan government collapsed. And you have now the U.S. president being under attack for this humiliation, this embarrassment, this shock. So please respond to the following statement. A senior level foreign or defense policy official in the Biden administration will soon resign because of the Afghanistan withdrawal and American chaotic evacuation. So that was the plan I had, but we only have 5 minutes left. So you see the US senators who are not, the Republican senators do not control a majority of the votes, but they still have power to block and obstruct the Biden administration. So one senator is slowing down tremendously the Biden administration's not approval of Biden administration nominees to staff the US foreign policy bureaucracy. So Ted Cruz, who's going to run for president in 2024, is trying to get the Biden administration to stop approving, accepting the Russian gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 to Germany, and he's slowing down drastically the approval of U.S. Biden administration nominees to be ambassadors and deputy secretaries of state. And also Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, is vowing to block all national security nominees over the Biden administration's handling of Afghanistan, insisting he will not budge until Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, resign for what happened in Afghanistan. Cruz and his allies insist he is taking a principled stand on Nord Stream 2, a gas pipeline project from Russia to Germany, has long been an issue of high interest for him. So my question to you is, I'm not going to ask you to break up into groups. Do you think somebody is going to have to resign publicly for what happened in Kabul in Afghanistan a month ago? Is somebody going to have to resign for the chaotic evacuation? Will you see somebody resign from the Biden administration to take the blame for the humiliation of what happened in Afghanistan? And so do you strongly agree, neutral cannot decide, disagree, strongly disagree? And so let me go back to the vote here and ask you to vote on whether or not you think somebody's going to have to resign for what happened in Afghanistan. You have 15 seconds. So two of you agree. You think somebody, or no, three of you agree. Somebody's likely to resign.
I can't find it.
Yeah.
Where is it?
And so we see here,
Okay.
4 agree that somebody's going to resign. Neutral cannot decide. Disagree. 1 person disagrees. And 3 people disagree. There's still Americans there in Afghanistan who are trying to get out. Wow. Fascinating times here in the United States, in world history. And so we have to keep focusing on this. So let me go back to the notes. And I think those are the notes here. And so I think you can see that. Yeah, okay. So yeah, there was a consensus, between the Democrats and Republicans that the Soviet Union is a Russian version of Nazi Germany. Oh my God! And so they agreed to set up the Bretton Woods institutions that created the International Monetary Fund and what is today the World Trade Organization and what is today the World Bank, the Marshall Plan to refund the reconstruction development of Europe and also in Japan, not under the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine, the commitment of the United States to defend anybody that's threatened by communist subversion of the Soviet Union. This is all lacking today. And the creation of NATO was also done during the Cold War. The National Security Act established the Department of Defense in 1947, as well as the National Security Council. So Anthony Blinken is Jake Sullivan. Sorry, Jake Sullivan is National Security Advisor to Joe Biden. That means he's the chair of the National Security Council. That Josh Hawley wants Jake Sullivan to resign from. Also created a Central Intelligence Agency. All of the institutions, the instruments that exist today emerged during the early Cold War. Truman deployed forces to South Korea without a congressional declaration of war. But he employed instead the UN Security Council approval and set a precedent for Vietnam, Central America, and the Middle East. And the CIA got involved in covert operations under the Eisenhower administration, after the Truman administration. And Congress basically was set up to legitimize. It was relegated to the role of just, approving what the US president decided to do to fight the Cold War against the evil empire. Okay, that's it for today. Anything else? If not, your first draft of your midterms are due on Saturday. Okay, bye.